icy weather. I have a number of people that you're going to hear from this afternoon about the State's Reform Act. We have folks from South Carolina, Jill Swing from South Carolina's Compassionate Care. We have veterans that you're going to hear from this afternoon. We have folks from law enforcement that you're going to hear about, and industry about this bill. I'm very excited. I've been working on this piece of legislation for the better part of the year, for about 9 months. I've been working on this. When I was a state lawmaker in South Carolina, I worked on medical cannabis reform in the state of South Carolina. And then today, as a member of Congress, I have an opportunity to continue that work with the State's Reform Act. This particular piece of legislation, when I look at what's going on across the country for the better part of 25 years, since 1995, when the state of California was looking at medical use for cannabis, there are only 3 states today across the entire country that have no cannabis reform regulations or laws whatsoever. So my home state of South Carolina, for example, we allow CBD. Just south of South Carolina and Florida, they have medical marijuana. And then you can go to other states across the country like California that have adult use cannabis. And so when we're looking at cannabis reform at the federal level, we have to understand and take into account all of the different provisions, reforms, regulations, and laws that are already existing across different states across the country. And I would categorize this bill as what some have reported as a compromise bill. There are pieces of this legislation that bring forth ideas that previous Republican bills that have been filed. It also takes into account some of the reforms that Democrats have filed in previous legislation related to cannabis. And this legislation, I believe, has something good for everyone, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican. And so, first off, at the board, right here. The first thing I want to talk about is how the legislation protects kids. I'm a mom. I'm a single mom. I have 2 kids myself, one in high school and one in middle school. This legislation includes provisions that would incentivize states to ensure that cannabis use under the age of 21 would be illegal. It would prohibit advertising and marketing to children as well under the age of 21. This went. It deschedules cannabis, taking off the Schedule 1 list. And we do that so that we decriminalize it and we allow cannabis to be researched. We know that there are medical benefits to it, so descheduling will do that. It protects each state's unique laws and reforms. It takes into account at the federal level that every state is different. My state of South Carolina, we have CBD. Florida has medical marijuana. California has adult use cannabis. And so what we're going to do at the federal level would tax it and regulate it, recognizing all of that. And to do that, the agencies that we would utilize at the federal level, if you're a grower, it would be regulated under USDA. If it's a product, it would be under ATF. If it's with interstate commerce, which is included in this bill, it'd be under TTP, for example. If it's going to be regulated as medical, it would be done under the FDA agencies. And so we took special care to understand and recognize that we would need different agencies. It would be regulated like alcohol in that regard. This legislation will also protect veterans. There are special provisions in there that ensure that veterans are not discriminated against for using cannabis. It ensures that veterans, when they're going for their VA benefits, that they don't lose their VA benefits. If they're a vet, they would be allowed, the VA would be allowed to describe and prescribe cannabis based on its benefits for that veteran. So there's special protections in there. This bill would also support businesses, in particularly small businesses. That's very important to this piece of legislation. There are certain protections. And so if this bill were to be passed today, this is turnkey legislation, but we have the Safe Banking Act that was passed out of the House in April. It's also included in the NDAA. But if we were to pass this bill today, there wouldn't be a need for safe banking because businesses would operate and be legal and regulated just like alcohol. So that would not be an issue. There's also special funding for small businesses within the 3% excise tax where that funding would go. And that leads me to the 3% federal excise tax. I kept it very low. One of the biggest differences that you'll see in the State's Reform Act is regards to the taxation. Now, if you look at states, you're going to see like be under 4% in order to reduce the opportunity for illicit markets or black markets in different states, depending on how they're legalized. Now, within the 3% federal excise tax, Section 502 of the bill relates to the excise tax. Section 501 has to do with where that funding would go, and there's some room in there to negotiate where those things would go. But for example, part of the excise tax funding would go to small businesses and supporting them. Part of it would go to law enforcement and second chances, retraining some of our law enforcement. It would go to states that have opioid crises that they're facing across the country. There is some funding that would go to veterans and mental health. There's funding from the excise tax that would also go to educating kids who are under the age of 21 on cannabis, ensuring that they aren't using it. And then one of the other elements to this bill is safe criminal justice reform. So at the federal level, this legislation would expunge records for strictly cannabis use. It would allow those that were serving today that are strictly cannabis in federal prison for that they would be released. Now that does not include, there's an exception for those who are convicted of a DUI and an exception for those who might be trafficking or a member of a cartel gang, etc. That is an exception within this. And then the last one, the big thing too, is this would be regulated a lot like alcohol. Whether we're talking about the actual farming of cannabis at that level, regulating product like that, etc., would be done very similarly or identical to alcohol. Another big difference between this piece of legislation and what's been filed previously by both Republicans and Democrats. So in about an hour, we're going to officially file the bill. We'll have 5 Republican original co-sponsors. We are getting a lot of great feedback from Republicans and Democrats on this bill. My main goal is to get as much Republican support as I can initially, and we're hearing great feedback from both chambers, from both sides of the aisle on this piece of legislation because it is a go-between, a turnkey piece of legislation that is a compromise between what has been filed previously on both sides of the aisle. And I'm very proud of this work. We have a lot of people that have contributed and made this bill better. And there is, there's so much in here for everyone, whether you are a Republican or whether you are a Democrat. There's something in this bill for each of you, and I think most Americans to like. And this is a 70-30 issue across not only my district, but across the country. So with that, we're going to give a minute to a few people ahead. The first person I want to introduce is Jeremiah Mosteller, who's a senior policy analyst for AFP, or Americans for Prosperity.
Thank you, Representative.